The North African sun blazes relentlessly over a landscape that seems to stretch to infinity. Sand and sky merged into a shimmering mirage, the heat rising in waves from the desert floor. At the crest of a dune, a solitary figure scans the horizon through binoculars. Erwin Rommel, the man soon to be called the Desert Fox, watches his forces advance with an almost surgical precision. Tanks churn the desert sand, infantry moves in fluid columns, and artillery pounds positions just out of sight. Each movement just a piece of a larger, unfolding design. The desert was both his ally and his adversary, a vast, unforgiving terrain that magnified both brilliance and error. The Allies whispered of a commander who could appear where least expected, strike with lightning speed, and then disappear like a phantom in the dunes. His own men revered him and followed where he led, inspired by a presence that was as calm as it was commanding. Yet the desert demanded much. Supply lines were strained, men faltered under the heat, and every victory carried the weight of an inevitable cost. Rommel's genius lay not only in maneuver and speed, but in the ability to read the desert itself, to turn shifting sands and open vistas into instruments of war. But even as his forces surged forward, there was a shadow on the horizon. Intelligence reports whispered from Cairo to Tripoli, and the relentless pressure of Allied counterattacks hinted that the tide might turn. History would remember Rommel for his daring raids and audacious tactics. Yet this brilliance existed along the seeds of ultimate defeat. This is the story of Erwin Rommel, German strategist and military commander, known as the Desert Fox. Welcome to Wars of the World. Born on the 15th of November 1891 in the quiet town of Heidenheim in the Kingdom of Württemberg, Erwin Rommel was not, at first glance, destined for military greatness. The son of a schoolmaster, he grew up in a middle-class household that valued discipline and education rather than martial tradition. Yet from a young age, Rommel displayed a fascination with engineering, spending hours designing model aircraft and building gliders. This early passion would shape not only his character, but also the analytical and almost mechanical way in which he approached warfare. In 1910, Rommel entered the cadet school at Danzig, joining the 124th Infantry Regiment of the Imperial German Army. Although not a natural soldier in the traditional Prussian mold, he excelled in tactical thinking and physical endurance. His instructors quickly recognized the potential. According to Field Marshal, The Life and Death of Erwin Rommel, written by Daniel Allen Butler in 2015, quote, "Rommel did not simply follow orders, he dissected them, improved upon them, and then executed them with precision." End quote. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Rommel was posted to the Western Front. He soon demonstrated a flair for aggressive maneuver and improvisation in the chaos of modern warfare. But it was on the mountainous Italian front where his reputation truly began to take shape. Assigned to the elite Alpenkorps, Rommel fought in some of the harshest conditions of the war. During the fighting in the Julian Alps, he led small unit assaults through terrain that many considered impassable, favouring surprise and speed over brute force. At the Battle of Caporetto in 1917, Rommel led a daring assault against entrenched Italian positions, capturing hundreds of prisoners and advancing far beyond his original objectives. In his 1937 memoir, Infantry Attacks, he recalled, quote, "We attacked at first light, slipping through the mist. The enemy had no idea where we would appear. By the time they realized, we were already behind their lines." End quote. Rommel's actions would earn him the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor at the time, and it cemented his status as a rising star in the German military. Rommel's style of leadership during this period was defined by personal bravery. He was often found at the front, leading his men from the very tip of the spear. Historian Daniel Allen Butler observed that, quote, "Rommel's greatest weapon was not his rifle or machine gun, but his ability to inspire confidence through example." End quote. This direct, hands-on approach would remain a hallmark of his commanding style throughout his career. After the war was over, Rommel stayed in the Reichswehr, the drastically reduced German army under the Treaty of Versailles. While many officers chafed under the restrictions, Rommel saw it as an opportunity to refine his tactical thinking. He served in training and instructional roles, developing a reputation as a meticulous planner and a gifted teacher. It was during this time that he began writing Infantry Attacks, a tactical study based on his First World War experiences. The book would later become required reading in German officer schools, and notably also studied by Allied commanders for its insights into mobile warfare. By the 1930s, Rommel had risen steadily through the ranks, though he remained outside the core of Prussian aristocratic officers who dominated the higher echelons of the army. He was, in many ways, an outsider, pragmatic, analytical, and deeply devoted to his troops. His reputation as a field soldier, rather than a political operator, set him apart and prepared the ground for the legend that would grow in the deserts of North Africa. The late 1930s saw Erwin Rommel entering a new phase of his career. Germany was rearming at a remarkable pace, and Rommel's reputation as a gifted tactician had already caught the attention of the regime. In 1939, he was appointed commander of the Führerbegleiter Battalion, Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard battalion, bringing him into direct contact with the Nazi leader himself. This post, unusual for a frontline soldier like Rommel, placed him close to the political heart of the Third Reich, and it ensured he stood out when new commands were distributed. Rommel's relationship with Hitler was pragmatic rather than ideological. He never joined the Nazi Party, and while he admired Hitler's military ambitions, he was generally indifferent or even skeptical about the regime's racial doctrines. Historian David Fraser notes in Knight's Cross, A Life of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, that Rommel, quote, admired Hitler's energy and his drive to restore Germany's military power, but also that he was a soldier first and foremost, and not a political zealot. End quote. Though aware of the regime's brutality, in private he expressed unease with Nazi anti-Semitism, ultimately keeping his focus firmly on military matters and avoiding overt political engagement. In February 1940, Hitler rewarded Rommel's loyalty and energy with commander of the 7th Panzer Division, a remarkable promotion given his lack of experience with armoured units. The division was still forming, which allowed Rommel to shape its structure and ethos. The invasion of France in May 1940 gave him the right opportunity to prove himself on a grand scale. Within weeks, his division earned the nickname Ghost Division, advancing so rapidly that even German headquarters were struggling to keep track of its movements. During the crossing of the Meuse at Dinant, Rommel led from the front, personally overseeing bridging operations while under fire. His willingness to expose himself to danger became a defining feature of his command style. In the book Infantry Attacks, he had written, quote, "The art of war is to move faster than your opponent can comprehend, and to strike before he can adjust." End quote. This philosophy now played out in real time, as his division bypassed strong points, disorientated the enemy, and pushed deep into French territory. The relentless tempo of the 7th Panzer Division stunned both the enemy and Rommel's own superiors. A French officer later recalled, quote, "It seemed as if the German tanks were everywhere at once. They were like shadows." End quote. Historian Desmond Young observed in Rommel the Desert Fox that German headquarters often learned of Rommel's victories only after the fact, as he was already pressing on to his next target. His combination of speed, surprise, and personal leadership marked him out from the crowd of his many more cautious contemporaries. However, his success came at a cost. Some within the Wehrmacht criticized his disregard for traditional lines of communication and the risks which he took. Either way, the results were undeniable. Tens of thousands of prisoners captured, a swathe of territory seized, and a formidable reputation established. Rommel was promoted to Generalleutnant and awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for his achievements in France. Hitler, who valued commanders who embodied daring and initiative, became convinced that Rommel was the right man for the next critical assignment. In early 1941, Rommel was ordered to North Africa to take command of the newly formed Deutsches Afrika Korps and to support the Italian Regio Esercito forces against the British. It was a dramatic shift, from the rolling green fields of France to the unforgiving deserts of Libya. As Rommel prepared to depart for Tripoli, he had begun to form not just a new command, but a growing legend. In just a few short months, he had transformed from a well-regarded officer to one of the most talked about figures in the German army. His actions in North Africa would soon make him a household name on both sides of the war, soon to be known as the Desert Fox. When Erwin Rommel arrived in Tripoli in February 1941, he was stepping onto a new kind of battlefield. The endless expanse of the North African desert offered both opportunity and danger. For Rommel, it was the perfect arena to apply his bold and fast-moving style of warfare. For his enemies, it would soon become synonymous with a relentless adversary, a commander who seemed to materialize out of nowhere, strike hard, and then disappear just as quickly. Rommel was sent to Libya to stabilize Axis positions after Italian forces had been pushed back by the British. Officially, the Deutsches Afrika Korps was meant to take a defensive stance, but within weeks of his arrival, Rommel defied those orders. Asserting the British as overextended, he launched a surprise counter-offensive in March 1941. His forces moved rapidly across Cyrenaica, outflanking British units and seizing towns that had been lost months before. His ability to exploit gaps, strike swiftly, and mask his intentions became the cornerstone of his desert strategy. One of his most audacious moves came during the siege of Tobruk. When British and Commonwealth forces withdrew into the port city, Rommel surrounded them in an effort to crush their hold on this vital supply hub. Tobruk was a natural fortress, heavily defended with a deep water port that allowed the British to keep it supplied. Despite repeated assaults throughout 1941, the defenders held out. Rommel adapted by turning the siege into a tool. While Allied forces were tied down with defending the port, he maneuvered elsewhere, raiding supply lines and forcing them to respond to his tempo. His approach to warfare in the desert was unlike that of most Axis commanders. Historian Ronald Lewin, in Rommel as military commander, noted that Rommel, quote, fought with an almost mechanical sense of movement, always thinking one step ahead, turning the vast open spaces of the desert into an ally. End quote. He relied heavily on speed and deception, often using feints to draw Allied forces off balance. German tanks would strike in unexpected directions, supported by mobile artillery and infantry. His use of reconnaissance allowed him to exploit even minor weaknesses in Allied positions. Meanwhile, logistics in North Africa were nightmarishly complex. Supplies for Rommel's forces had to cross the Mediterranean, vulnerable to British naval and air attack, and then traverse hundreds of kilometers of harsh terrain. Fuel shortages were constant, yet Rommel learned to operate with minimal resources, pushing his units further than many thought possible. He was often accused by senior German officers of being reckless with supply, but his audacity paid off, at least in the early stages. More straining than the resources was Rommel's relationship with his Axis allies. He had little patience for the cautious approach of the Italian forces, and he often bypassed the Italian command structure altogether, issuing orders directly to their troops. Yet even so, he did command genuine respect from many Italian soldiers, who saw him as a leader willing to share the hardships of the front. Among his own men, Rommel was adored. He was known to visit forward positions personally, often exposed to enemy fire, earning a reputation as a commander who led from the front. A German veteran later recalled, quote, "He was always there, dusty, calm, and utterly confident. You followed him because he made you believe we could do anything." End quote. It wasn't just the Axis that shaped Rommel's reputation. Allied media played an unexpectedly large role in forging the Desert Fox legend. British war correspondents began referring to him by that name after a string of tactical reverses in 1941 and 42. Rommel's daring raids and unpredictable movements captured the public imagination. He was portrayed in newspapers and radio broadcasts as a brilliant, almost chivalric opponent, a man who fought hard but honourably. This served a dual purpose. It explained Allied setbacks while elevating the eventual victory over him as a great triumph. Meanwhile, Nazi propaganda equally embraced the myth as well, portraying Rommel as the embodiment of German military genius. His image was carefully managed and widely circulated, making him one of the most recognizable commanders of the war. Rommel's string of successes, however, was not destined to last. The strategic situation began to turn against him in late 1942. The arrival of fresh Allied forces, improved logistics, and air superiority slowly eroded his ability to dictate the tempo in the desert. The turning point came at the Second Battle of El Alamein. Facing General Bernard Montgomery and a vastly superior Allied force, Rommel was forced onto the defensive. Despite his skill in delaying actions, the Afrika Korps was outmatched in both men and materiel. Montgomery's methodical advance blunted Rommel's trademark maneuvers, leaving little room for his usual improvisation. Historian Niall Barr, in Pendulum of War, The Three Battles of El Alamein in 2005, observed, quote, Rommel's brilliance could not compensate for the overwhelming weight of Allied resources. He was a master tactician, but El Alamein was a strategist's war, and he lacked the means to win it." End quote. In November 1942, Rommel began a fighting retreat westward, marking the beginning of the end for Axis ambitions in North Africa. The momentum that had once carried the Deutsches Afrikakorps across the desert was now reversed, as British forces under Bernard Montgomery pressed forward with superior numbers, air cover and logistical strength. By late 1942, Rommel found himself forced into a fighting retreat westward across Libya. Supplies were dwindling, Axis air support was faltering, and the once carefully maintained aura of the Desert Fox was beginning to crack under the strain of strategic reality. Rommel had always excelled in maneuver warfare, using speed and deception to unbalance his opponents. But against overwhelming Allied resources, he faced a different kind of fight, one defined by attrition and retreat. In his own words, Rommel reflected on the difficulties of just such a reversal. Quote, "When one must constantly yield ground, the strain on men and material is enormous. Initiative passes to the enemy, and with it, the ability to dictate the course of events." End quote. The defeat at El Alamein was not simply a battlefield loss. It represented the turning of the tide in North Africa. As the Allies launched Operation Torch in November 1942, opening a second front in the theatre, Rommel and his exhausted forces were caught in a pincer between advancing British 8th Army in the east and the newly landed Anglo-American forces in the west. The German-Italian army, stretched thin and chronically undersupplied, could only delay the inevitable. By early 1943, Rommel's health was deteriorating. Years of relentless campaigning in harsh conditions had taken their toll. He began suffering from severe stomach and liver ailments, forcing him to spend increasing amounts of time away from the front. According to historian David Irving, in The Trail of the Fox, Rommel confided to his wife Lucy that he felt utterly spent and doubted whether the Desert War could be sustained. In March 1943, he was granted leave to return to Germany for treatment, and so command of the Afrika Korps passed to Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. Within 2 months, Axis forces in North Africa would be forced to surrender. Rommel's removal from the African theatre did not mark the end of his career, however. Recognized by Adolf Hitler for his skill and celebrity, he was reassigned to Europe in late 1943. The task before him was vastly different from the open desert. He was to oversee the fortification of the French coast against an anticipated Allied invasion. The Atlantic Wall, as it came to be known, was intended to be a near impenetrable defensive line stretching from Norway all the way to the Bay of Biscay. Rommel toured the coastline obsessively, ordering the reinforcement of beach obstacles, minefields, and gun emplacements. To his frustration, however, he encountered layers of bureaucracy and unrealistic strategic assumptions. Where he saw the need for aggressive coastal defense, the German High Command clung to rigid doctrines that ignored the mobility of Allied air power. Behind his professional dedication, Rommel's private doubts deepened. He had long maintained a soldier's loyalty to Germany, rather than to the Nazi Party itself, and unlike many senior officers, he had never joined the political party. As the war's tide shifted decisively against the Reich, Rommel began to question not only Hitler's strategic competence, but also the morality of the war itself. In conversations with fellow officers, later documented by Anthony Bridge in The Narrow Margin, The Battle of Britain and the Rise of the Desert Fox, he openly criticized Hitler's refusal to allow tactical flexibility. Quote, "The Führer no longer listens to reason. He gives orders as if the world bends to his will." End quote. Moreover, reports of atrocities committed on the Eastern Front and the persecution of Jews and other minorities troubled him. Although there is no evidence that Rommel directly opposed these policies earlier in the war, his later remarks suggest a growing disillusionment. In the post-war testimony of several officers close to him, Rommel was described as increasingly uneasy with the regime's fanaticism and brutality. This internal conflict ran parallel to external pressures, as Allied bombing raids intensified over Germany and the Western Front loomed ever closer. Rommel found himself at the center of two opposing forces: his duty as a soldier to defend his country, and his personal conviction that Hitler was leading it to ruin. By early 1944, as invasion became imminent, Rommel was no longer the daring commander racing across the sands of Libya. He was now a weary field marshal, confronting not only the military reality of a looming defeat, but the moral weight of serving a regime he could no longer fully support. By 1944, Erwin Rommel's reputation as a brilliant commander was overshadowed by the gathering storm in Western Europe. Tasked with overseeing the fortification of the French coast against an anticipated Allied invasion, he was acutely aware that D-Day was inevitable. The so-called Atlantic Wall, which he had helped to construct, was incomplete and poorly supplied, and he frequently clashed with Hitler over defensive strategy. Rommel argued for mobile reserves and flexible responses to landings, warning that rigid, static defenses would easily be overcome. Historian Maurice Philippe Remy, in The Myth of Rommel, observes, quote, "Rommel's strategic foresight was ignored in favor of ideology and obsession with fixed fortifications," end quote, leaving the German position in Normandy precarious. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, proved the accuracy of his concerns. Rommel's units attempted to repel the Allies with every available resource, but delays in reinforcements and restrictions imposed by Hitler hampered their effectiveness. He personally inspected frontline positions and rallied his men, yet the overwhelming Allied air superiority and logistical capacity rendered German counterattacks largely ineffectual. First-hand accounts from soldiers under his command repeatedly note his presence on the front lines, being calm and resolute amidst the chaos, offering encouragement even as defeat became increasingly likely. Rommel's experiences during this period deepened his disillusionment with Hitler's leadership. He had long maintained loyalty to Germany rather than the Nazi Party, but witnessing the disregard for sound military advice, the interference of party officials, and the ideological rigidity of the High Command intensified his skepticism. Liddell Hart, in The Rommel Papers, 1953, notes that Rommel was, quote, "increasingly torn between duty to his men and obedience to a leader whose decisions were no longer based on military logic." End quote. This tension would draw him, whether directly or indirectly, into the orbit of conspirators seeking to remove Hitler from power. On July 20th, 1944, an assassination attempt known as Operation Valkyrie was enacted. a group of German officers, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, attempted to kill Hitler using a bomb planted at his Eastern Front headquarters in the Wolf's Lair. The plot aimed to overthrow the Nazi regime and negotiate a surrender with the Allies, but it failed when Hitler survived with relatively minor injuries. In the immediate aftermath, the Gestapo conducted a ruthless investigation, arresting and executing dozens of conspirators. Rommel's name appeared in some reports as a potential sympathizer, or at least a tacit supporter of the conspirators, though some historians continue to debate whether he actively participated in the plot. What is clear, however, is that Hitler saw Rommel as a potential threat. He was a respected field marshal whose popularity and dissenting views made him politically dangerous. In October 1944, he was summoned and given an ultimatum: face public trial and almost certain execution, or to take his own life in exchange for a state funeral and protection for his family. Rommel chose to preserve his honor and to safeguard his loved ones. On the 14th of October 1944, he took his life, reportedly consuming a capsule of cyanide. The official announcement framed his death as the result of wounds sustained in an earlier air attack, allowing the regime to exploit his image as a loyal soldier. He was accorded a state funeral, attended by senior military figures, and the propaganda narrative of Rommel as a good German was carefully maintained. This myth, portraying him as a professional soldier caught between duty and conscience, endured long after the war and contributed to his posthumous reputation in both Germany and the West. Rommel's death marked the end of a career defined by tactical brilliance and audacity, but also by the moral and strategic dilemmas faced by German officers under the Third Reich. His legacy, both celebrated and mythologized, would become a lens through which future generations examined the complex interplay of military skill, personal integrity, and the inescapable consequences of serving a regime like Hitler's. As Remy concludes, quote, "Rommel was a soldier of extraordinary talent, yet his story is inseparable from the politics, ideology, and tragic circumstances of his time." End quote. Rommel's death in 1944 marked the end of a remarkable military career, but it was only the beginning of the legend that would endure long after the Second World War. In both Germany and the West, Rommel was remembered as the Desert Fox, a commander of audacious tactics and personal bravery, whose exploits in North Africa had captured the imagination of both soldiers and civilians alike. During the immediate post-war years, Allied accounts emphasized his professional skill and, importantly, his supposed distance from the Nazi ideology, portraying him as a soldier honorably caught in the machinery of a brutal regime. Historian Charles Messenger notes that, quote, "Rommel's reputation was carefully curated by both Allied and German narratives, creating a figure who embodied chivalry, competence, and tactical brilliance." End quote. During the Cold War, Rommel's image served broader ideological purposes. In West Germany, he became a symbol of a good German, one whose loyalty lay to the nation rather than the party, helping rehabilitate the image of the German officer corps. In Allied countries, he was used as a case study of military genius, often cited in military academies for his maneuver warfare and leadership under pressure. Yet this veneration was not without controversy. Historians and scholars have debated whether Rommel was genuinely apolitical, quietly opposed to Hitler, or simply a pragmatic soldier whose moral qualms were secondary to duty. Sönke Neitzel, in Tapping Hitler's Generals, highlights that Rommel, quote, walked a fine line between obedience, dissent, and personal conscience, reflecting the complex realities faced by German officers in a totalitarian state. End quote. Modern reassessments have sought to cut through the mythology, recognizing both his military brilliance and the ethical ambiguities of serving under Hitler. Rommel's tactical innovations, daring operations, and leadership style remain widely studied, but contemporary scholarship emphasizes context. His fame cannot be disentangled from the regime he served. As the sands of the desert have long settled, the myth of the desert fox endures, a story of audacity, skill, and the moral tensions inherent in war, reminding us all that legends are shaped as much by memory and interpretation as by action itself.